The era of colonialism stands as an undeniable turning point in Native American history. But the narrative extends beyond the glorified tales of exploration and exchange. Beneath the surface lies a disturbing truth that has long been overshadowed. As European powers expanded globally, the Columbian Exchange introduced new goods, foods and animals to the Native Americans. However, amidst these exchanges, a dark and haunting reality unfolded. Devastating diseases like smallpox, measles, and more silently swept through Native American communities, leaving death and despair in their wake. This historical tragedy serves as a stark reminder of the catastrophic toll colonization took on the indigenous people. Join us as we explore the heartbreaking chapter of this colonial legacy. In this episode of the Natives' Journals, you will discover the devastating impact colonization and European diseases had on the populations who bore the brunt of this tragic event. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to subscribe and click on that notification bell so you never miss an update. In the 1500s, North America was entirely unfamiliar to European explorers. They viewed it as a completely new land, filled with undiscovered animals, plants, and fascinating people with unique cultures and languages. While this was a novel world for Europeans, it had been home to various indigenous groups for a long time. These indigenous people are now referred to as American Indians. Archaeologists suggest that American Indians may have inhabited North America for up to 50,000 years. They were the continent's original inhabitants and, interestingly, skilled explorers themselves. Their migration to North America occurred gradually, over thousands of years, as they arrived on foot or by boat from Asia. These early explorers ventured through icy terrains and along coastlines, eventually settling and spreading across the entire continent. As time passed, American Indian communities underwent transformations as they adapted to various environments. Their resourcefulness allowed them to thrive in deserts, forests, coastal regions, and grassy plains. These native peoples excelled in hunting and farming, establishing towns and engaging in extensive trade with other tribes. These were the individuals European explorers encountered when they arrived in America. In the 15th century, European nations began exploring the world to find new lands and resources. Their main motivations were power, prestige, and wealth. Europeans wanted to expand their influence worldwide and gain recognition. They were also after valuable resources like gold to increase their prosperity. Lastly, religion, represented by God, played a significant role in European colonization and the spread of Christianity. Countries such as Spain, England, France, and Portugal financed expeditions to Asia and the New World. Italian explorer Christopher Columbus embarked on a journey for the Spanish crown in search of a new sea route to India. Many European monarchs sponsored these journeys to tap into profitable trade with Asia. In 1492, Columbus landed in what he believed to be India, but it was, in fact, the Caribbean in the Americas. Upon Columbus's arrival, he and his crew encountered the native Taino and Arawak people. The Native Americans welcomed Columbus and his team of explorers. The arrival of English, French, and Spanish explorers in North America brought significant changes to American Indian tribes. The arrival and settlement of Europeans in the Americas resulted in what is known as the Columbian Exchange. During this period, European settlers brought many different technologies, animals, plants, and lifestyles with them, some of which benefited the indigenous peoples. Europeans also took plants and goods back to the Old World. Potatoes and tomatoes from the Americas became integral to European and Asian cuisines, for instance. Despite all this, unfortunately, Europeans also carried a hidden enemy to the Indians: new diseases. American Indians had no immunity to the diseases brought by European explorers and colonists. While Europeans had some resistance to these diseases, native people had none. These illnesses sometimes spread through direct contact with colonists, and at other times through trade among native groups. The consequences of this exposure to European diseases were devastating, often leading to the rapid loss of entire villages. The first indigenous group Columbus encountered was the Tainos, numbering 250,000 on Hispaniola, representing the dominant culture in the Greater Antilles and the Bahamas. Within 30 years, approximately 70% of the Tainos had perished. They had no immunity to European diseases, leading to devastating outbreaks of measles and smallpox. One such outbreak occurred in a camp of enslaved Africans, which then spread to the nearby Taino population, resulting in a 50% reduction in their numbers. Despite efforts like religious education and protection from warring tribes through the encomienda system, the Tainos faced increased punishment for rebelling against forced labor. This eventually led to the final significant Taino rebellion, which took place from 1511 to 1529. After enduring years of mistreatment, the Tainos began exhibiting suicidal behaviors, including women aborting or killing their infants, and men resorting to extreme actions like jumping from cliffs or ingesting untreated cassava, a lethal poison. Eventually, a Taino leader named Enriquillo held out in the Baruco mountain range for 13 years, causing significant harm to Spanish plantations and their Indian auxiliaries. In response to the escalating revolt, Emperor Charles V, also King of Spain, dispatched Captain Francisco Barrio Nuevo to negotiate a peace treaty with the growing number of rebels. 2 months later, following consultations with the Audiencia of Santo Domingo, Enriquillo was offered any part of the island to live in peace. The laws of Burgos, enacted between 1512 and 1513, marked the first formal set of rules governing the conduct of Spanish settlers in America, especially concerning indigenous people. These laws prohibited the mistreatment of indigenous individuals and promoted their conversion to Catholicism. However, enforcing these laws in distant colonies proved challenging for the Spanish crown. Also, colonization had devastating effects on the Arawaks of the Lesser Antilles in the Caribbean, ultimately erasing their culture by 1650. By 1550, only 500 Arawaks had managed to survive, and their descendants are still part of today's population. In Amazonia, indigenous societies suffered and continued to endure centuries of colonization and genocide, leading to persistent hardships and a significant reduction in their population. However, the primary cause of the drastic decline in the indigenous population was epidemic diseases. These diseases were introduced from Africa and Eurasia. Epidemics fueled by illnesses like smallpox, measles, influenza, chickenpox, malaria, sexually transmitted diseases, and cholera, which European colonists brought through them, swept through Americas, causing devastating consequences for the indigenous communities. Epidemics took a significant toll on individuals with disabilities and left many more people with disabilities within Native American communities. The practical and societal challenges related to disability were quite evident. For instance, scarlet fever could cause blindness, deafness, or even both. Smallpox outbreaks often led to blindness and left pigmented scars on the skin. This was particularly distressing for many Native American tribes, as they took pride in their appearance. The skin disfigurement resulting from smallpox had a profound psychological impact, to the extent that some tribe members, unable to cope with this condition, tragically resorted to suicide. Following initial contact with Europeans and Africans, diseases from the Old World led to the deaths of 90 to 95% of the native population in the New World over the next 150 years. For instance, smallpox claimed the lives of 1/3 to half of Hispaniola's native population in 1518. It also played a significant role in the Inca Civil War of 1529 to 1532 by killing Incan ruler Huayna Capac. Smallpox was just the beginning. A subsequent epidemic such as typhus in 1546, influenza and smallpox in 1558, smallpox again in 1589, diphtheria in 1614, and measles in 1618 further devastated Inca culture. During the 16th century, smallpox swept through South America, causing devastating outbreaks among indigenous populations in what are now Colombia, Peru, and Chile. However, its spread to the north was slower due to the sparsely populated desert region of northern Mexico. In 1633, the virus was introduced separately to eastern North America by colonists who arrived in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and local Native American communities were soon affected by the disease. It reached the Mohawk Nation in 1634, the Lake Ontario area in 1636, and the territories of other Iroquois tribes by 1679. Between 1613 and 1690, the Iroquois tribes in Quebec endured 24 epidemics, almost all caused by smallpox. By 1698, the virus had crossed the Mississippi River, resulting in an epidemic that nearly wiped out the Quapaw Indians of Arkansas. Smallpox had a devastating impact in Mexico. Unintentionally introduced in Veracruz with the arrival of Panfilo de Narvaez on April 23, 1520. It ravaged Mexico during the 1520s, possibly claiming over 150,000 lives in Tenochtitlan, the heartland of the Aztec Empire. This outbreak played a role in Hernan Cortés' victory over the Aztec Empire during the European colonization at Tenochtitlan, present-day Mexico City, in 1521. The European colonization of the Americas had a profound and lasting impact on the lives and cultures of the indigenous peoples living there. While we can't pinpoint the exact population of the Americas before colonization, experts estimate that indigenous populations declined significantly, with some estimates suggesting a reduction of 80% to 90% within the first few centuries. European arrival. Unfortunately, explorers and colonists unknowingly transmitted these diseases to native populations. Additionally, the introduction of African slaves and the utilization of commercial trade routes played a role in further spreading these diseases. In the beginning, the spread of infectious diseases in Europe was slow, because most Europeans didn't show active symptoms or carried them in a dormant state, thanks to their inherited immunity developed over generations of exposure to these diseases. In this case, individuals with greater resistance survived. However, this changed when Europeans started trafficking a large number of enslaved people from Western and Central Africa to the Americas. Columbus looked for another source of labor as the indigenous populations diminished. Enslaving people from Africa was cheaper, and they were highly knowledgeable about tropical agriculture. Like indigenous peoples, these African individuals had no inherited resistance to European diseases. In 1520, an African who had contracted smallpox arrived in Yucatan. By 1558, the disease had spread throughout South America and reached the Plata Basin. With the population sick and decreasing, it became increasingly difficult to oppose the European expansion. The violence inflicted by colonists on indigenous peoples accelerated the loss of lives, including massacres and enslavement. According to the U.S. Bureau of the Census, In 1894, the North American Indian Wars in the 19th century resulted in the deaths of approximately 19,000 Europeans and 30,000 Native Americans. There are several reasons behind the devastating impact of Afro-Eurasian diseases on indigenous peoples. Many European diseases, such as smallpox, influenza, and measles, originated from domesticated animals that were not native to the Americas. As is often the case with disease, the very young and the very old were the most vulnerable and had the highest mortality rates. The loss of the older generation meant the loss of knowledge and tradition, while the death of children only compounded the trauma, creating devastating implications for future generations. Some European diseases introduced to the Americas, like yellow fever, were manageable if contracted during childhood, but often fatal in adulthood. Children who survived these diseases gained immunity for life. However, when adult populations lacking this childhood or inherited immunity came into contact with these diseases, the results were often fatal. An epidemic of smallpox in 1617 to 1619 claimed the lives of about 90% of the native population near the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 1633, in Fort Orange, New Netherland, Native Americans were exposed to smallpox due to contact with Europeans, leading to the decimation of entire Native American communities. The virus reached Lake Ontario in 1636 and the lands of the Iroquois by 1679. Smallpox continued to wreak havoc, causing the deaths of at least 30% of West Coast Native Americans during the 1770s. The North American smallpox epidemic of 1775 to 1782 and the 1837 Great Plains smallpox epidemic brought further devastation and severe population decline among the Plains Indians. In response, the U.S. federal government established a smallpox vaccination program for Native Americans in 1832 through the Indian Vaccination Act of 1832. In Brazil, the indigenous population declined significantly from an estimated pre-Columbian peak of 3 million to approximately 300,000 in 1997. Though this figure is a topic of debate, furthermore, the Spanish Empire and other European powers reintroduced horses to the Americas. Some of these horses escaped and bred in the wild, marking the return of horses to the continent after a 7,500-year absence. This reintroduction had a profound impact on indigenous cultures in the Great Plains of North America and Patagonia in South America. Domesticating horses allowed some tribes to expand their territories, engage in more extensive trade with neighboring tribes, and hunt game, particularly bison, more effectively. The availability of horses also affected the dynamics between indigenous peoples and European settlers. European powers often sought alliances with horse-riding tribes, utilizing their mobility and military capabilities in their colonization efforts. However, the reintroduction of horses to the Americas had far-reaching consequences for indigenous societies, altering their ways of life, trade networks, and even their interactions with European colonizers during the period of European colonization. In the Americas, this illustrates how the introduction of new elements, even unintentionally, can reshape entire civilizations. Another factor during the colonial era that left Native Americans vulnerable was the slave trade. When European nations waged wars, Native Americans who had sided with the losing side often became servants or slaves. In some cases, Native Americans were even transported out of colonies, such as South Carolina, and sold into slavery in distant places like Canada. The development of the Atlantic slave trade forever changed the course of European settlement in the Americas. Other transatlantic travelers, including diseases, goods, plants, animals, and even ideas like the concept of private land ownership, further influenced life in America during the 16th and 17th centuries. The exchange of pelts for European goods, including copper kettles, knives, and guns, played a significant role in changing the material cultures of native people. During the 17th century, native peoples grew increasingly dependent on European trade items. At the same time, many native inhabitants died of European diseases, while survivors adopted new ways of living with their new neighbors. Regrettably, the mistreatment of Native Americans by Europeans and their descendants in the United States did not start or end with the colonial era. It's a long, dark chapter in history that persisted over time. While it began during the colonial era, these injustices did not cease. Instead, they often intensified during the 19th century. This period was marked by a series of policies and actions that further marginalized them and had devastating consequences for indigenous population. This led to greater restrictions on their freedoms and the tragic extermination of indigenous populations. Additionally, the 19th century witnessed the spread of disease, conflict, and encroachment on tribal lands, leading to further displacement and loss of resources for Native American populations. The expansion of the United States westward, driven by the idea of manifest destiny, directly impacted and displaced indigenous peoples who had inhabited those regions for generations. Interestingly, some 21st century climate scientists have proposed a unique connection between these historical events and environmental changes. These scientists have suggested that a severe reduction of the indigenous population in the Americas and the accompanying decrease in cultivated lands during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries may have contributed to a global cooling event known as the Little Ice Age. Sadly, the mistreatment of Native Americans was not confined to the past. It continues to have repercussions today, affecting issues such as land rights, health care, education, and cultural preservation. Indigenous communities have faced ongoing challenges in reclaiming their cultural heritage and achieving justice for past wrongs. The impact of colonization continues to be felt in the present day, underscoring the importance of acknowledging and addressing these historical injustices. However, the legacy of colonization casts a long shadow over the present, as indigenous communities persist in their quest for justice and cultural preservation. In the face of ongoing challenges, the resilience of these communities shines through, forging a path toward a brighter, more equitable future where the wounds of history can begin to heal. Their efforts aim not just to mend the scars of the past, but also to keep their cultural heritage thriving and deeply valued. The echoes of colonization may persist, but the strength of these communities promises a future where justice prevails and the rich history of indigenous cultures continues to thrive. Thank you for joining us in this episode. If you found this content informative and valuable, we encourage you to show your support. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to click on the notification bell. By doing so, you'll stay updated with our latest content, and your engagement helps us continue bringing you important stories and insights. Thank you for being part of our community.